Welcome to Is This for Kids? I'm Jonathan Beard of Blevins, father of 3, and normally I think most media is the absolute worst that's marketed towards kids, but I'm a huge fantasy football fan with the kids.
Yeah, and I am Katie, MrsRuvi. I'm a mom of 5, and last year was second place in my fantasy league, so unfortunately I was the first loser. Yeah. But today, we get to introduce the man, the myth, the legend, the king of fantasy football himself, Andy Holloway. Andy, tell us about your kid's situation.
Yeah.
How many kids you got?
Yeah, I've got 3 kids, and it's, some of them love fantasy. Some of them are not as competitive, but it's really fun.
Excellent. So what we like to look at in these things, fantasy football is something that's sort of new for us as a concept. But since we're coming into football season, I know you're a huge football fan. Fantasy football is a really great way for all of our kids are watching it. But there's always this question of whether or not professional sports and the NFL specifically are appropriate for kids. So what do you think is there in the NFL's content and in fantasy football that might be something parents want to shield their kids from?
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously it's a competitive game. Like everything about sports, like there's kind of 2 sides to it. And when we started this podcast, it was a lot about like not leaning into like the basement dwelling, abandon the family to watch the game away from everybody. It was all about how does this add to our enjoyment of the weekend and bringing people together. All of my best memories with my dad revolved around watching sports, listening to sports, and like enjoying that fandom experience together. So there's the sports gambling side that exists now that is more regulated. That is probably something that you want to keep a really close eye on when it comes to how the media markets that to your children and what piece that plays in the big picture of sports. But for us on this show and with fantasy and with the sports fandom experience in totality, it's never really been about winning money at the end of the week. It's about the experience and the ride and enjoying what you're doing. And I hope that that's what fantasy is bringing to the space, but that's not necessarily what you find in all of media.
Yeah, I think one of the coolest things about fantasy football is that you, as a parent, you can control it for your kid. So I think you do have to be careful and shield your kid from joining that random ESPN league where there's just inappropriate dudes changing their username every single week.
Right.
So I've got my 7-year-old coming to me last year like, Daddy, I'm facing double D's nuts in fantasy this week. What does that mean? And I'm like, oh, don't worry about it, kid. Great. But this year, we're doing a league with him and some of his best friends and then the parents as well. And so there's almost nothing to shield them from out in the fantasy football world outside of what Andy's talking about with some of the gambling commercials and stuff on there. And for me in football in general, it's just mostly the commercials that you have to shield your kids from, whether it's something, a product that's inappropriate or gambling product that's happening out there. But otherwise, the product on the field and spending time together is my favorite part of family and football.
Yeah.
Yeah, and if I could jump in real quick, there was one thing I actually thought of with sports and with my kids when they were smaller is that I was so into football and I wanted to bring them to games and to let them experience that. But like the game day experience was not super kid friendly at a young age for football. Like that was something that I was shocked about. I know a lot of stadiums will have like alcohol-free zones in the stadium now where you might not be exposing your kids to as belligerent of fandom. But that was something I was a little surprised about. I thought you could just, I would bring my young kid there, and that wasn't something I was going to have to shield them from. But there's a sense of like you show up at that stadium, and I had moments of feeling like I was in a gladiator arena of years of old where this is, this is pretty vicious at times. And so I need to maybe protect them from some of the more excitable fans.
So he is not going to be going to a Raiders game anytime soon is what I'm getting from this.
Or a Rams game.
The Raiders are the worst.
The Raiders
are the worst.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, live sports is one thing. A little bit in the last year when we were watching on Sundays with the kids, we were noticing, because you've always got those mic'd up episodes and things like that. Or, we've got great cameras now. This is way different than it was when you and I were growing up. So you can see very clearly, what people are saying on the field. And football players, I don't know that they're all altar boys. Let's just throw that out there.
Shocker.
Yeah. So like every now and then you'll see a very clear swear come off somebody's mouth or, some very unsportsmanlike behavior. You might want to have a little conversation with your kid about what good sportsmanship looks like and who's a gentleman player and who's not, that kind of a thing. But as far as shielding is concerned, when you're talking about NFL specific, not necessarily fantasy, but like watching games, I would think that, the live experience that Andy touched on and the swears would be about it. unless you had some thoughts about injuries.
Yeah, well, I will say this. The cameramen are kind of instructed these days to not show replays of very significant injuries after they happen. So they're not always going to get it right. If you're watching it live, you'll see it at least once. But I think for the most part, even I look at the Damar Hamlin situation where his heart stopped on the field. Like, they did a great job of covering that. It was a good opportunity for parents to talk to their kids about the dangerousness of the sport and the dangers of it, but also how this doesn't happen all the time. Let's pray for them, etc. It's funny, like if your kids know swear words, they're gonna know exactly what you're saying when someone's mouthing it. Yeah. Mine don't yet, and so it's super adorable when they're like, I know what he said.
You.
Oh, trust me, I know what he said, Dad. And I'm like, what'd he say? He said frickin'. And I'm like, yeah, man, don't say that.
Oh my gosh,
that's what he said.
Andy, are your kids that good that like they don't even know the swears? They've never even heard them before?
Oh no, they're acclimated, I think, pretty well. I think they know what's going on, and but fortunately they don't repeat them, at least that we've witnessed. But it is part of, sports brings out really extreme emotions, and it's interesting because with football, a lot of kids play sports. So even though you're not playing on that level, you are identifying with the competitiveness of playing and those opportunities, Kate, that you mentioned, of a chance to talk to them about, okay, this guy reacted this way, this guy reacted that way. How serious is this in the grand scheme of life? You're definitely going to have some opportunities to have those conversations.
Yeah, that's for sure, like the shepherd component of this, right? Where you're able to talk your kids through some of the worst behaviors, and especially if they're following fantasy or if they're playing fantasy, the odds are that they're going to be spending a little bit more time Googling the players' off-season activities and the things that they're doing off the field. And that might be a place where we really need to shepherd our kids through what content they're consuming when it comes to fantasy. Andy, do you have any good pointers for parents for how they can steer their kids maybe away from the less desirable things football players get up to in March?
Yeah, and unfortunately, those are part of the storyline of sports and being a high-profile athlete. Those things are always going to kind of bear themselves out, and that's something we run into. Like, we don't like talking about those storylines on the show. Like, they're just not, we're not legal experts when there's a legal situation, and some of these are, different, more difficult things to talk with your kids about. I do think one really good shepherding piece when you're teaching your child about fantasy football and about the sports experience in general, and it's something we see adult fans struggle with, it's kind of understanding that these are human beings on the field. And whether it's just the injuries, like it's easy for a fantasy player, and if you play fantasy, it's easy to be like, oh darn, that guy got hurt, and I'm gonna just replace him with this guy over here. Like these are real athletes with real families that change teams and cities, and not letting it distill down into just a stat line. Mm-hmm. We've had athletes and players on the show, and that's the most annoying thing for them is they get hate on social media. They get feedback in the stands about, you didn't do this thing for my team. Like, dehumanizing the player, I think, is something that can happen over time playing the game. And that would be an amazing thing to kind of teach your child early so that they don't go through that experience and become the fans that all these players actually hate.
Yeah, for sure. Although Cam Sutton was terrible in the playoffs, so it was good riddance, is what I'm saying. When I was like, I believe it. You know how bad he sucked in the playoffs? I believe it.
Strong emotions.
I have a lot of feelings about Cam Sutton.
Yeah. When it comes to football, I don't know, Andy, if you have experiences with your kids, but like I've noticed it's very different than when I was a kid, and I'm only 36 years old. Mm-hmm. When I was a kid, like, man, if I would have done the gritty after scoring a touchdown when I was 10 years old, my dad would have had me on the bench in 2 seconds. And not because it's a no fun league, but because I was 10 and I scored a touchdown against other 10-year-olds. And like they're brand new might be brand new at the game. I feel like celebrating has gone up a ton. And what is allowed for kids to do on really any field, football, soccer, basketball, baseball, you name it, has kind of changed. And like I'm okay with NFL. I'm not that part of the no fun league. I'm totally cool with people celebrating in the NFL and in college. You've earned it. You've done it. You're playing against people that are similar caliber as you. But I think one thing you can do to shepherd your kids is to teach them good sportsmanship, celebrating like with the team after the play instead of individually against other people your age who might be playing for the first time.
Did you watch Receiver this season?
I'm on episode 5 right now.
Okay, so like in the very first episode, Amon-Ra St. Brown is sitting with his dad after he did that, let's go with raunchy end zone dance, and his dad was like, absolutely not.
Yes.
Not my kids. None of this.
Yeah. He was super frustrated. Yeah. It's weird because I feel like my answer to that whole equation is the most old man reaction too. Like I just feel like I am all about, that's what I was taught growing up playing sports, and like I would have been ashamed to behave in a certain way. And yet I feel like I'm talking generationally very differently, because these athletes also are all about personal brand, and they have all these partnerships, and like the high level athletes are doing things today that are very different than maybe the way I grew up, but also they have more control over the way that they're marketed and the money that they can make and what they can do after football. But I'm with you though. Like my personal convictions would be that's a good area to say what are the best qualities that you learn playing sports, and one of them is being part of a team, right? It's not just about yourself. So I think on a high level that would be another one of those areas where let's not have no fun. Let's celebrate. Let's not throw a penalty every time somebody shows any emotion.
Yeah.
But at the same time, let's make it about the team. And that hopefully is the bigger piece of the puzzle.
Yeah.
100%.
We've talked a lot about how families can share in an NFL and a fantasy experience, but I think it's really kind of cool. Andy, you wrote a book about this, about having a football family, right? What does it look like to share in all that? Like, tell us about your football family, Andy.
Yeah, no, I mean, that book came out of a lot of my childhood memories and what I viewed as the greatest parts of playing sports. It wasn't necessarily, winning is awesome, and winning drives competition and what makes you be driven to get better, and it's a fundamental part of playing. But at the same time, all of my memories were about the fact that sports brought people together. That book was the outpouring of that spirit in my own life, and seeing my kids grow up and knowing that my best memories, or a lot of them as a kid, were jumping up on the coffee table when my home team won a game with my dad freaking out in the room and my mom hiding because she was too nervous to watch the screen. And I already got some of those memories with my kid of, I'm a sports fan through and through, the Suns and basketball. And when we went to the finals, running through the house with my son at the time. And just the bringing of people together, I think, is the spirit of that book. What meant a lot to me to write it was just kind of like putting that out there as like sports doesn't have to divide. It doesn't have to be dad hiding in the basement, placing parlays. It can be, hey, this is going to make our weekend better as a group. And that's kind of what it was built on.
Yeah. Plus, if you're a Detroit fan, as John and I are, you get the best pizza. Because Detroit-style pizza is, in fact, the best pizza. Although, fun story. So Andy and I have been friends for years now. One of the first conversations I remember having with Andy is he asked me something about what football team do I follow for college football. And I grew up in Grand Island, Nebraska. So I was like, oh, I follow the Huskers. And Andy was so disappointed in me as a person. He's like, oh, it's like liking UCLA or something like that. I don't remember what you said, but you were so mad at me.
Strong emotions. Yeah. I think Nebraska, I don't think anybody liked them in the mid-90s when they were dominating everybody. So
yeah, this was the early 2000s, but yeah, they were, I mean, now it's like an alliance.
I mean, listen, no one likes Nebraska now, but they should actually be okay this year.
You think?
Yeah, it's actually going to be fun for them. The Big Ten's going to be a lot of fun.
Wow.
I will say, like, for me, sports has been the biggest blessing in my family's life, probably growing up personally, but also I look back and I'm like, the best moments I had were when my dad was fully invested in watching a game with me. He was a Bears fan, I was a Lions fan. We didn't do that whole thing together, but Michigan football, when they played Ohio State, my dad would take me to Buffalo Wild Wings to watch that game. Like, there was something about that. And I'm with me and my kids, I'm like, it's not a once a year thing or a twice a year thing. It's a multiple times a week thing where we're watching the basketball game, the hockey game, the football game, and that's like the most media my kids consume. And just being able to answer the questions they have and cheer together and talk about all the things that are happening, it's one of my favorite ways to connect with my kids. You just got to be careful for some of the stuff you're seeing on the sides of advertising and all that stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. And we have a great tradition. We take a bunch of our friends from church, all come over every Sunday and watch games kind of all day and kind of hang out together. So our kids, we don't live anywhere near our extended family, but our kids get to build this extended family that we made up through watching sports. And every winter football season, we get to have that great experience. And I think it's a fantastic thing for kids.
Love it.
Yeah.
It's awesome.
Hey, Andy, if people wanted to hear more from you, where would they find you?
You can just go to thefantasyfootballers.com. We got a free podcast that's available every day, all season long. And so we are knee deep in fantasy football and NFL. And I don't have room in my brain for college football. So I had no clue Nebraska was going to do well because there's no more room for football up here. But if you want fantasy football, we try to make it really entertaining and so that you can enjoy the ride all year long.
All right. And John, if people like this episode, where would they find more from us?
They should go to isthisforkids.com. We're very active on all the different ways you can find us on there, releasing content every single week as well. Ruvi loves our YouTube and Instagram, so check us out and leave some comments.
Yeah, I'll comment back at you. There's just so much content out there for us to consume as parents.
Jonathan Beard of Blevins.
I'm Katie, MrsRuvi. Let us help you decide.
Is this for kids?